All right, welcome back. I hope you had a nice bio break, got yourself some food. We are circling back on our next session. It's a panel discussion with members of the Uproot Project. I'm guessing not everyone is familiar with what the Uproot Project is. It is a network for and by environmental journalists of color. It seeks to bring diverse voices to the forefront of environmental reporting. I know everyone here is a member, myself included, and I know Rachel and Maya are actually steering committee members, so they direct the direction of the Uproot Project as a network, as a community space, as a collaborative space. So the purpose of this session here, where the first one was a keynote introduction to storytelling as a diverse mode and method for change, is to really dive into more traditional forms of storytelling like journalism as an impactful tool. Everyone here is amazing, experienced, fabulous environmental justice journalists, and we're really excited that they're here to speak to their expertise, their backgrounds, what got them into journalism, and how we can go about entering journalistic spaces, if you so choose, for environmental impact. So just to start us off, I want to introduce Melba Newsome. She is an award-winning journalist with more than 20 years of experience contributing investigative, education, health, and environmental features to regional and national publications, including Scientific American, Nature, National Geographic, The Assembly, Wired, and High Country News. She is a two-time Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting grantee, a 2023 Alicia Patterson Fellow, an MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative Fellow, and a UC Berkeley 11th Hour Food and Farming Fellow. She's currently an adjunct journalism professor in the Wake Forest University Journalism Department. So, fabulous, experienced, slaying. Yes, Melba. Next we have Rachel, who's joining us all the way from New York. Rachel Ramirez is a climate reporter at CNN, where she writes about all climate science, energy, and environmental justice. Previously, she worked for Vox and Grist, and has written for other publications including The Guardian, HuffPost, and Rolling Stone. She's currently based in New York City, but was born and raised in the Pacific island of Saipan. Thank you so much, Rachel, for bringing your expertise from a pretty big newsroom, CNN, for us to learn from today. And finally, certainly not least, last but not least, Maya. Maya Kapoor is an award-winning writer, editor, and educator based in North Carolina. She writes about climate change, biodiversity, and environmental justice. She has reported extensively on the Southwest and U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Currently, she is an assistant professor in the English department at North Carolina State University, where she runs the journalism minor. Thank you so much for joining us, Maya, and everybody else. We're really excited for this conversation. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves a bit deeper than in these 3-sentence bios and telling us a bit about your work experience.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Is that better? Okay. I was thrilled to be asked to participate in this panel about journalism and environmental journalism in particular, and storytelling. I wanted to say, my bio says 20 plus years of experience, and so if I do this for another 30 years, I will still say 20 plus years. I'm not going any further than that. But this has been a long road. I have been working in journalism, more general interest, and just writing about a variety of things that included environmentalism and health and science. But the last couple of years, my focus has really turned to disparities in health and environment. And so that still covers a lot, because I tell everyone that every story is an environmental story. No matter what you think about, every story is an environmental story, because environment means the world. And this world is touched by, how we live. The environment touches everything: how we live, where we live, what we eat, the air we breathe. And so I've really focused on that a lot, and I'll just say briefly, it came out of when I was reporting on the impact of coronavirus on Charlotte's Black community. That was my first Pulitzer Center grant, and as I was telling different stories, because we keep very clear data along race and ethnic lines, And they were some of the first in the country to show how many Black people were getting sick and dying from coronavirus early on. And they could document that with the numbers. And I reported on that for about a year. And every single story I told where the people were the sickest and suffering the most were also the people who lived in the worst environments and had the worst air quality and the social determinants of health that they were, food and health care, transportation, all of those things came to the fore. And I said, we're not talking about the environment enough and how these things are intersecting and creating greater problems and disparities for people of color. And this has been a really great opportunity, but also very painful one, because you tell these stories over and over again and it kind of gets to you, but that just shows how important it is. So I'm happy to be here to talk about those things. Thank you.
Gosh, I think Melba covered pretty much like the gist of environmental justice storytelling and reporting. But I think it's great that we're hosting this in North Carolina, the birth of environmental justice, and we were actually just talking about that earlier. And I'll let Melba and Maya, who are actually based in North Carolina, kind of touch on that a little bit more. But what I wanted to talk about is kind of rooted from my own personal experience of being raised in the Pacific Islands, and what really got me to reporting about climate change and also environmental justice is, I truly believe that when you're telling a story and you're reporting on a story, is that you really have to put a human face into that story to make it more effective. And so coming from the islands, I really experienced a lot of these extreme weather events, evacuating whenever we get tsunami warnings or typhoon warnings. It was normal to us and my family back home. And so a lot of my stories were really rooted in that personal experience. And then another part of that is the environmental justice part of that is militarization, rampant militarization across the Pacific Islands. Like when you go back to World War I, World War II, the Pacific Islands were really contaminated by just military pollution in general. And when you think about the amount of emissions that the US military alone released into the atmosphere, if it's its own country, I'm pretty sure it's like the top 5 countries in the world, the biggest polluter, in terms of CO2 emissions. And the people that are getting disproportionately impacted by those emissions, by the impacts of those emissions, are the Pacific Islanders, who are indigenous to their lands, relying on the ocean, relying on their land to live and sustain themselves. And so that is where I'm coming from whenever I write stories about environmental justice and climate change and sea level rise and all of that. But there's definitely an intersectionality to everything environmental justice related, from immigration to healthcare and so on. Melba talked about air quality, which is a big part of environmental justice storytelling, where refineries, oil and gas refineries are located, and you overlay that with the redlining maps. They're almost always intersected. That is basically kind of my experience reporting in the last 7 years or so. But I will say, I just wanted to add before I pass it on to Maya, I was actually a business reporter going out of college. And the reason I kind of pivoted to environmental justice was because when I was a business reporter, it was this predominantly white industry that didn't respect me as a person of color, as a woman of color, and I felt like it personally. And so, and I was writing a lot about the oil and gas industry, and that was where I made the connection that the oil and gas industry are kind of like the biggest perpetrators of climate change, and they knew about this. And so I immediately got a fellowship and pivoted to environmental reporting afterwards. So that is a little bit about me and the stories that I write and where it's rooted from.
Hey, thank you all for having me here. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with both of you. You're such amazing journalists. My story is a little bit different. I'll just tell you how I got into environmental reporting. I actually started out in the sciences, and I have a bachelor's degree in biology. I have a master's degree in biology, and as I was kind of developing my career, I realized two things. One of which was that I got my master's and I was like, I don't really want to get a PhD in biology because I don't want to specialize more. I'm like curious about everything, and I love being able to just like fixate on one thing, talk to people about it, and then move on to the next thing. And so I'd always been interested in writing, and it seemed like science writing was a way to get to sort of like feed that curiosity and kind of be a generalist. And then the other thing was that in the sciences, and particularly in like natural resources and conservation, I didn't see myself in the work that was being done at that time. And I think that has changed in the intervening years. But you know, I would think about like explaining to my relatives, who a lot of whom are immigrants, like why I'm studying this random plant in this random place, and it's like not necessarily of interest to the community that I come from. And I learned as I went that, kind of like what Rachel said, my most exciting moments doing research were when I got to talk to people about their experiences. And I think at heart I was secretly an environmental historian, because I really, really love reporting on what's happening on the ground now in the context of, you know, the history that led to the conditions that could allow those things to happen. And I also really like reporting in a way that doesn't make people like the subject of it, like or the object of a story, but like, you know, talking to people who maybe are facing environmental justice issues about their solutions, and what I can learn from them about how they approach those issues. And I love that journalism lets me kind of get into issues in that other kind of different way.
And I appreciate both you, Rachel and Maya, for highlighting a bit of your journeys. Actually, I want to make sure I turn it back to Melba. How did you get into environmental journalism? And if there's anything you guys would like to elaborate on along that question. I know the entry point is very different for people. Some people enter journalism and then transition to environmental journalism. I know myself, the environment is the center point, and journalism just became an avenue for impact. So how did you get into this?
Yes, I started out in journalism and as a general interest writer back in the late 90s. Started out after, briefly, I was in college and I was an English major. And then by the time it was when it comes time to graduate, I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? Who's going to pay me to diagram sentences? And the answer is nobody. So I had to, just find other ways to use my English degree, and I started writing. I had other careers. I did things. I worked with federal courts and then worked as a litigation assistant. And when I started, I had no idea how to publish stories in magazines. I thought every story in a magazine was written by a staffer, somebody who worked there. And you would go to the grocery store, there was an entire aisle of magazines from top to bottom. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. You go there, you get the end caps, and they're mostly like special issues and, things telling you how, they don't even tell you how to get thin thighs anymore. I guess they just, I don't know, whatever they do. But, so a friend of mine said, you should try writing magazines. You're so opinionated. And I'm like, okay, I think. But I didn't know how to do that, so I figured out, read a couple of books about how to pitch stories and things like that. And actually the first book that I read was called How to Write Irresistible Query Letters, and queries are what you said. And the person who wrote that book is a really good friend of mine now, like many years later. But I started pitching stories, and I figured out that you had to, in order to break in, you had to bring them a story that they couldn't get elsewhere. Because they're not going to hire me to do a story about, how to lose 5 pounds and put it on the opposite page from a chocolate cake. They got plenty of people who can do that. So I just said, okay, these true life stories that all the women's magazines tell, And that was it. I started out like, I left my husband for a serial killer. and how I got trapped on a ship in the middle of a terrorist attack. These are all real stories I did, you know, talking about Cosmo and Glamour and things like that. And they were very lucrative and fun, but they weren't impactful. I felt kind of embarrassed after I did a lot of them because they were so ridiculous. But I didn't feel kind of that I was empowering anyone. And in the middle of that, you know, I did write serious stories about health and you know, and I stumbled across a story in Louisiana about environmental racism down Cancer Alley, how all these people of color were just inundated with pollution and things like that. So I did different kinds of stories. And after the pandemic started, I just told you how I got more to environmentalism and writing about that from an environmental justice perspective, because being someone in North Carolina, being Black, all these things were just so impactful. And I always cared about it when I said, we need more people who look like me to tell stories about people who look like me, instead of people just parachuting in. And even though they didn't sympathetic, a lot of times they look at people in these communities as other, as a little strange. They kind of are patronizing and saying things like, well, why don't they just move from the Hall Farm area, instead of realizing they can trace their heritage back to chattel slavery in those places. This was the land of their father's father, their father's father's father, and what they did to get and to just ask them to move and go away. It's something that, you know, you cannot understand. You probably can't unless you're from there or of that place. And I feel that it's important to have, like I said, people who are from those communities to tell those stories.
No, they say that too about the Pacific Islands. Like, why can't you just move out to the Pacific if you're getting battered by typhoons a lot? Well, they're connected to their land, and it's not that easy. It's a privilege to move out. And just going back to your question, Cameron, and I will say this is one of my full circle kind of stories, is back in 2015, I was still a student in college, and I actually went to University of Portland. So I was far away from home, and this super typhoon, Category 5 typhoon, hit my hometown. It was called Super Typhoon Soudelor. I still remember it, and I was watching it, that little circle of the storm kind of barrel towards the islands, and I suddenly lost contact with my family, my mom, my dad, my sister, and I was super worried. And one thing that I did do after posting several posts on social media was, this was when CNN did this iReport thing where they submitted citizen journalists can submit articles, amateur articles, very terrible articles, which is how I wrote mine, into that portal. And I sent one, my very first CNN submission, iReport submission about Super Typhoon Soudelor, but it was more written as an angry article that they weren't covering it. So I was like, why aren't you guys covering it? And so anyway, that was basically kind of my wake-up call, I guess, to be in environmental journalism at that time, and pursue journalism at that time, that really solidified my path when I was a college student. And then, just fast forward now, I'm at CNN, and I'm still trying to hold them accountable in terms of covering things that needs to be covered. And so I guess I just wanted to add that about that full circle moment of the things that needs to be covered is sometimes from the communities of the person that you hire. So I don't think there's a lot of Pacific Islanders in newsrooms, and so that was kind of my leverage point when I got hired. You need a Pacific Islander person in your newsroom to cover these stories. So anyway.
Thank you guys so much. And I know it's just really inspirational and affirming, just knowing that I'm drawing from the same experiences, the same land connections, the same understandings of those ancestries and histories and connections in place when I'm writing about environmental racism, my own stuff. And I'm a student. I've always been a student. So it feels really good to hear y'all's experiences and your starting points is very similar to perhaps other people in the room as well, and how you might enter journalism or storytelling. You all, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say I actually don't have that same history of many generations of connection to the place where I now report or live. But I come from a family of refugees, and so I can't go back to my ancestral homeland, and that has made me very curious about displacement as an environmental topic, and really curious about finding stories that involve adapting or change. And so I think all of that personal history can be part of what you do, even if you don't have the lucky experience of having that deep-rooted connection to the place where your family still is.
Thank you so much for adding that, Maya. I think that's a very critical point. And even everyone up here is a woman of color. We're all coming from, if not the same, we're not coming from the same backgrounds, but I know one professor here at Duke came to a class. His name is Barry Yeoman. He covers a lot of environmental justice issues, environmental racism in North Carolina as well. And he highlighted that it should not just fall on the communities that represent the individuals that represent the communities that are most impacted. It should also fall on those who don't identify, whether you're talking about white individuals, or I know Barry identifies as Jewish, coming into Black communities and trying to really understand those interactions and those relationships and dive into it so that he can report on it on behalf of people like Melba, Rachel, or Maya. I think that's an important touch point as well. You guys really highlighted some of the issues that are of greatest interest to you. I think we would love to dive a bit more into the lessons you guys have learned reporting on the various topics you've been able to cover. I think a lot of people, when they think of environmental journalism, are not just, they're thinking about climate change, thinking about climate reporting. They're not thinking about the intersections with politics, economics, housing, education, land use, everything, all of the things. You guys have kind of spoken a little bit to those things. So can you highlight whether it's an issue, it's a multitude of issues, feel free to say whatever you want, the lessons you've been able to learn in reporting on some of the deep-seated, heavily political, environmental justice issues you've reported on?
I think one of the things that I've learned, and I'm not surprised about this, but it's, I kind of realize how deep it goes every day, and that is a lot of poor people, a lot of people of color, they think environmental issues, climate change, that those are elite issues that don't really impact them. When I start talking to folks, sometimes they'll think, oh, that's about how much snow you get in Jackson Hole and whether you can really ski, and that's about the polar bears. No. This is about what is happening in the Southeast, which is one of the most climate-threatened places in the world, in the Southeast of the United States. And then the closer you get to the coastal areas, who lives there? Black people, poor Black people who have been there. When we're talking about the Gullah Geechee community, who are among the most threatened people by climate in the world, because this is the land that nobody wanted post-emancipation, and they were given this land. So now they are faced with sea level rise, which is a huge threat. It's development because everybody wants that land now, so they're being pushed out. And then how you recover from a dramatic hurricane or something, even the federal government discriminates in who they give resources to rebuild and how much they give. A Black person's house and a white person's house can have the same damage, and they will give you dramatic amounts of difference because they say, well, this Black person's house is over in this neighborhood where it's not as affluent, but guess what? It costs the same thing to put a roof back on that house as it does to this house across town. And so all of these things come together, and when you have land loss that kind of doubles down on it. So I look at, in addition to me writing to like the world about the injustices, I'm also talking to my people. This is your fight. This is the existential threat that touches everything in your life. And I want them to understand that this is not some rich white person's problem. You are being harmed by this more than anybody else, and you need to, stand up and fight. And you see how the people there represented by, like in Eastern North Carolina, you just go there, they have a toxic tour that, someone leads, but you go there and you see where they put all of these things. Every bad polluting industry, you will look at the census tract and see who lives there. That's not by accident. So it's about waking them up. As long as it's been national news about the CAFOs and the hog industry, there are still people down there in Duplin County who don't realize what's going on around them. They just think they've always lived with that smell. They've never been able to hang their laundry outdoors without it getting flecked with feces and things like this. So I think part of that, I look at myself as an advocate, I use my journalism for activism. Maybe I shouldn't, but it's too bad. Who's going to tell me not to? So I just think that's critical that we do that work as well.
It was Ramirez, who's that iconic, my hero, Filipino journalist from the Philippines, who said that journalism is activism for the truth. So there you go. I guess one thing that I learned reporting on the environment and climate is that everything is just rooted in history. I mean, I'm just gonna echo Melba that it's no coincidence that the communities that are up and down Cancer Alley in Louisiana, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, are all Black folks, low-income Black folks, and they're now being plagued by oil and gas refineries, petrochemical facilities. That is no coincidence. It's literally the historical legacy of injustice, of slavery. And I'm not gonna steal Melba's thunder here, but that's the same for the Pacific Islands in terms of militarization. And I'm guessing, we're all, as someone who grew up in the Pacific Islands, we all had somewhat the same curriculum as the mainland U.S. in terms of history, U.S. history. But whenever I ask people if they've ever heard of the Battle of Saipan, no one has ever heard about that. And that's, Saipan is my home island. It's a U.S. territory just north of Guam, in addition to Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Guam. And the Battle of Saipan is the reason that basically we won World War II. But that history of militarization there left this legacy of pollution in Guam and Saipan. New species were suddenly introduced at the time. So I'm a freak for history. And so when I read a lot of historical fiction books, and nonfiction, of course, but historical fiction just blows my mind, but because there's some truth to that. But you learn a lot about, people in Saipan and Guam being born with like more than 10 fingers because of the things that were sprayed on the ground. And let me tell you, in Guam, 70% of Guam is owned by the U.S. military. And not last year, I think 2 years ago, they built the newest Navy base on Guam in like over 50 years. And as they were excavating the ground, they found cultural artifacts and human remains of what was the Chamorro people in Guam. And so that is environmental justice. That is just a symbol of what is happening, this historical legacy of injustice, again, in terms of environmental pollution connected back to the military. And so that's just one of the many stories from the Marshall Islands, from Fiji. And then, Maya brought up adaptation, having to adapt on top of the pollution and emissions that the military has been kind of emitting throughout the Pacific Ocean, the people that are disproportionately suffering are the Pacific Islanders themselves, and they're having to migrate out of their home islands. The island of Kiribati is now like having to migrate to Fiji, which is yet another Pacific island that's being inundated by sea level rise. So it's just kind of this, I don't know, heartbreaking history in the making that's rooted from this, legacy of injustice, I guess.
Yeah, something that both of your words reminds me of is always, as a reporter, thinking about how there is a difference between climate adaptation and climate justice. So that's one thing. So looking for those cracks, like where is adaptation causing more injustice and where is it not doing, where is it offering solutions? And then also, right now, like climate change can be a really hot topic in the media, but it's not the only disaster that people have adapted to or recovered from or dealt with. And it's not the only thing going on right now that it's important to keep in mind, because you see things happening like climate solutions that cause things like I've reported on, mining for lithium on like important ancestral indigenous lands, and or just different kinds of sacrifice zones that develop. So I think it's so important to not just look for solutions, but to look for who they're solving problems for. And I also think that listening to both of you talk, and somebody in a newsroom, someone who's a freelancer, that in my experience, being able to work with an editor who kind of understands my questions is really key. And so there's like two things you can do, I think. You can be a full-time staff writer out of place and try to make institutional change. You can also be a freelancer and try to change the narrative and the coverage that's happening. And I think both of those things are really, really important kind of projects, whichever works out for you.
Thank you all. I want to just always like to highlight points of resonance. I know as somebody personally who's worked in both a newsroom and as a freelancer, and seeing those intersections for impact, knowing that either option is feasible, and whatever direction you decide to go in, you're going to have some level of either institutional or societal impact is really affirming. I really want to echo, Rachel, your point about just sort of seems this recognition of history. I think we just heard that from Eileen Tran in our keynote address, this idea that we not only need to dive into these histories, but to what's the wording? Cover ourselves in them, almost immerse ourselves in these histories, and make sure that we are calling out these institutions in our journalism. And then Melba, just as somebody who has reported on the swine industry in North Carolina, who has worked in North Carolina, all of you guys, I hope at this point, are aware of the cumulative impacts of all of these industries that Melba has talked about in Sampson County, Duplin County, in eastern North Carolina, these intersections of land loss, black land loss, of CAFOs, poultry, swine, the wood pellet industry, a landfill. Like Sherry White Williamson here at Duke is a resource if you want to learn more about these intersections. I really just wanted to call that out because we are here at this school with an opportunity to engage in these topics in depth. If this is your introduction to it, I encourage you to do that additional research, do that additional digging, and even to dive more into the intersections and the issues that Rachel and Maya have also spoken to here today. Just because we're in North Carolina doesn't mean we just have to focus on North Carolina. I want to make sure there's time for Q&A, so I just have one. I know I had a whole list here. We did not get through it, but I want to make sure that we get to perhaps the tangibles of being a journalist, getting into journalism. I feel like it's a daunting process for people who have never done it before, who don't know how to start. So if you guys have any advice for people who are interested in exploring environmental storytelling, environmental journalism, even speaking to your processes as you are finding a story, identifying a story, actually going about reporting it, making sure that you, I know we're operating in different newsrooms too, so you've run into issues advocating for yourself or for your story in what might be a predominantly white space. I would love to just broadly hear more about how you guys have gone about navigating these spaces and advocating for yourself and pushing for journalistic change.
I'm gonna let Maya start with this because she's been on the end.
No,
and she's also like probably, as a journalism professor, got a lot to tell her students about this.
Yeah, you put me on the spot. Well, I will make a plug for the Uproot Project, which we represent. It's a fantastic organization for environmental journalists of color, but you don't have to be a journalist of color to join. And it can lead you to all kinds of resources like fellowships, finding out about job opportunities, conferences. Yes, we have. We're building a database of both of writers, journalists who outlets can reach out to, and also of experts on environmental topics, who are people of color that writers can reach out to. So I would say I've been an editor, I've been a staff writer, I've been a professor, and I think all of those places, all of those careers have roles to play. And one of the things that I really tried to emphasize when I was working as an editor was to prioritize stories that weren't being told. And so at one point I was managing the book review section of a magazine, and there would be a new publication by like a beloved white environmental author, and I would know that person was going to get covered many other places. So, their agent would email me about covering them, and I would turn them down and would get really mad. But I wanted to cover the equally talented writers who were not getting that bandwidth in other publications. And I enjoyed working with writers of color as an editor and kind of thinking through framing and positionality in their stories. On the other hand, as a writer, I really enjoyed getting to kind of find those stories that weren't being told and interact with sources who, were just gems to work with, who might not have been interviewed otherwise. And then as a professor, I feel like it's kind of funny because I teach journalism, but I didn't go to J school, so I kind of learned about journalism school by teaching. And I think that still there is some legacy of ideas about mainstream journalism that I think are maybe a little bit idealistic, including objectivity of the journalist. And that's something you run into often maybe not often, but as a journalist of color, where your objectivity on issues that affect communities of color may be questioned in a way that other journalists' objectivity is not. So I think that having worked with students for a while now, it's really interesting to watch them grapple with ideas like that and just kind of learn from their experiences.
I guess I'm going to speak first about the various places that I worked in. Obviously, I started as a student journalist. Well, not obviously. I still didn't go to J school, but I like to tell people that my major was student journalism, being a journalist for my student newspaper at the time, even though we didn't have a J school. And then I was interning in various places throughout college. And then after that, I did corporate journalism, which honestly traumatized me. So I went to nonprofit, which is GRIS. Highly recommend GRIS fellowships. That was when I really, really dove into environmental justice reporting. So if you're really interested in going this route, I would not look past GRIS and their fellowship program. They have Newsome politics fellowships, environmental justice fellowships. I think they now have indigenous fellowships, and then there's even different platforms like video and data and social media. So I think that's such a great opportunity. And then after that, I decided to go freelance. So I left GRIS after being a fellow and then reporter, and then I freelanced after that for 2 years. And then one of my mentors said, hey, CNN's launching a climate team. And now I'm back in corporate. So, but I think just finding that mentor and editorial support, and someone who will really guide you in terms of like, hey, this is how you should really advocate for yourself in a newsroom like CNN, in a big network like CNN. This is how you should fight for your stories. And really like tell them why they should invest in you is really important. So finding that guidance, finding that mentor is key for me throughout my journey. But one thing that I will say, if you really want to get deep into finding and telling stories and finding stories, is there's just so many different things. I would read basically everything in the internet in terms of like news articles about climate and environmental justice. And then I would go, I love to go into the EPA environmental justice screening tool, and just if you search it up right now, if you're in front of your computer and if you've never used it, and search up like environmental justice screening tool or mapping tool, you can see the sort of disparities of where, you know, environmental justice impacts, where sea level rise, where hazardous waste, where traffic proximity, where Superfund sites are located. And I can spend tons of hours in front of that mapping tool. And then another one is I like to file FOIA requests, which is basically the Freedom of Information Act. Obviously, I have the privilege of having CNN. I guess that's another difference. In nonprofit, you kind of have to, I mean, you also get like a free waived pass for filing FOIAs, but there's a certain limit to filing FOIAs in nonprofits, and that's what I encountered at GRIS. But at CNN, you kind of have this loads of resources, so that's one difference. But filing FOIA requests and what oil and gas companies are saying, what they know, things like that, tells you a lot of stories about things. I'm sure there's a lot more, but really digging into archives in your libraries and finding stories that way. And one more thing, Melba mentioned, I think, hinted at toxic tours. That is what I've been doing during the pandemic virtually, because that was like, I can't go out in the ground, so I'm gonna find people who are hosting toxic tours virtually in terms of taking videos, and they're like in Zoom. And, but you can do that in person now, join toxic tours in your neighborhoods. I was at one recently in Cancer Alley, and then this one chemical corridor in New Jersey. And really, once you're there, it really opens your eyes to a lot of environmental justice stories that you know, but like you don't really know until you're there. And it gives you a lot of color and understanding and a new perspective for when you write and tell that story to people.
When I talk about storytelling, that's the kind of easiest part to me, because not the actually writing and telling it, but finding them, because stories are everywhere. There's not a dearth of stories. There is a dearth of stories that don't get told. And because, everybody's kind of chasing the same little thing and following everywhere else, but there's just, you talk to people about one thing and they'll mention something else, and you find there's another road to go down where there's stories to tell. And so my challenge is kind of staying focused. Sometimes I have to not read the news, I have to not look at, because otherwise I'll be off on another story and I've got these many stories due, and then I'm like, ooh, what about that? And because you don't have time and you need to stay focused and pass that on to someone else. None of us have, went to J school, and I probably, I think I'm the only one who's never been on staff. I've never worked on staff for a publication or magazine or anything like that. And I don't regret that at all, because it has given me just a lot of room to tell the stories that I want to tell. Of course, I have to find people to buy them for me and say, yeah, Melba, go out and do that. But that's, when you bring them a story that they kind of haven't seen, and then you've got the connections, it's not a hard sell. I had been trying to get into Marie Claire for a long time, and with no succession of these true life stories. Then I found a woman who had been in the Sultan of Brunei's harem for 6 months. And so I pitched this story, and before I could press send, the editor was calling me. My phone was ringing, so that kind of started the thing. So there are stories to tell. It's about making connections and talking to people. And in this space, there are so many. And one thing that came out of, the the woke summer and the whole like unrest where people were going to do better, yeah, that lasted a long time, about how they treat people of color, yeah, okay. And was that they wanted Black writers. And so they wanted people in that space. They wanted writers of color. And I thought that was kind of, whatever. But, you take it. You take the opportunity you got, okay? I have somebody who wants to hear from me and who wants to publish my story, so I am going to use that. And I think that's critical to do, to take the opportunity. And when you do, make sure that your writing and your work is bulletproof, because people, I hate to say they, because that always sounds like a conspiracy theory. Somebody comes to me, they did this, I'm like, who's they? And tell me why. Because otherwise, if you can't tell me who they are and why they did it, it's just kind of crap and whatever. And so I think we are, I don't think we have the need or the room to make mistakes in this, because there's always someone who wants to say that this isn't legit. You have no idea how many times I get an email from somebody saying, you make everything about race. And so my response is, delete, okay, because I'm not going to argue with people, because you can never convince a racist that racism is a problem, and I'm not wasting my time trying. But I feel that, this is a kind of a calling, and as I think about, kind of winding down and retiring and all of that, I'm happy that this is how I plan to go out, and bring in more journalists, and hope and do whatever I can to make this a little bit more, make it less inscrutable than it is, this path. And it's about the stories. It's not that very, very complex thing. If you have something to tell, you can back it up. People are, I think they're really interested, and this is a time, because everybody wants a good environmental story. Like I say, I heard some little paper down in South Carolina is hiring a climate reporter, where 5 years ago, they wouldn't even put the word climate change in their stories, So we are making progress, and I just hope we keep on this path.
Amazing. And I know for those who aren't familiar with all the resources there are at Duke to get into journalism, I think that's where I got my start, writing for the Chronicle, writing for the 9th Street Journal here, just sticking on the stories. I think your point about way back about parachute journalism and this sort of distinction between those that while you're here, consider just diving into and continuing to report on the issues that have gone undercovered in the state, the communities that have gone underrepresented in our media. So I just wanted to echo that point. Shameless plug for Grist. I interned there. I loved it. I agree with you. And it's an amazing opportunity if you are looking for journalistic opportunities, as well as the Uproot Project. The QR code actually is to their website, and you can join for free. I think we wanted to make sure that we put that plug in there. But all of these are amazing resources, whether at Duke or at large, to engage in environmental topics through journalistic media. I want to open it up to Q&A if people have questions. There's a mic. If you want to, Amanda, you can go and yeah. Awesome. Oh, there's a lot of questions. Okay, amazing, guys. So I encourage you to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a second-year MPP with Cameron, concentrating in social policy. Before I ask my question, I have to say, because I will get on any soapbox when I can about how journalism was never objective, and that's such a myth. And I'm glad that three people in very different places, career-wise, are all agreeing that. So 100% we need to fix that myth. But my question is, I'm working on a journalism project for a project that Cameron's leading, and I'm trying to write about disaster gentrification in Louisiana. But I've been told by a few people that the community members most impacted are very tired of journalists and academics because it's been mishandled and but no one will say exactly what happened. And so I'm curious, like, how do you deal with people who are experiencing injustice and are tired of people telling their story wrong? How do you show that you'll do it different when they don't know you from Adam?
I think sometimes we go, we hear about a story down in a little town and we go and we make the mistake of just going to the person who's already been interviewed. And so that's kind of limiting, but it's also not very creative. And then they've got an experience, they're gonna kind of be pissed if somebody else wrote about them wrong. So you need to find their cousin and talk to them and then get it from them. And then you need to get it right. Sometimes they're very exhausted because you keep coming back to them for this little point, okay, did you go to the IGA supermarket, or did you go to Harris Teeter? And they're like, I'm tired of you asking me this question. But when the story comes out, they're going to be glad you asked them that question. So I think we just need to realize that not one person is the representative of the whole community, that we act like this person speaks for everyone. So go and find someone that hasn't really been quoted. Ask them, got anybody else you think I should talk to? And then talk to them, and then ask them, the next person, who they should talk to. But your responsibility is to get it right, no matter how long it takes.
Yeah, that's a classic example of extractive reporting, or extractive journalism is what we call it. And that's the problem with mainstream outlets. I mean, CNN including, they read stories from local news outlets, they see a name that was interviewed, say, by the LA Times, or, sorry, someone's calling me, or, a local news outlet, Texas Tribune, and then they'll be let's reach out to that person. There are dozens, millions of other people living in that area that just experienced X disaster. So what I would do is, this is why I also fight for, it's CNN, pay me to travel there, pay me to spend a month there and let me tell their story, gain their trust, gain their rapport, and just let me do my thing in terms of reporting and getting to know the community. So it's not parachuting, it's not extractive. And so as long as you can, for me at least, it's convincing them to send me out there. And two, it's another thing to gain their trust and make sure you as a reporter are culturally sensitive, culturally competent, and really letting them know that you're coming from a place where I'm just reporting your story, I'm just telling your story to the world, telling about what just happened here. And I would connect with, community organizations. There are a lot in Louisiana, Louisiana Bucket Brigade. I don't know if you've reached out to them. Yeah. Louisiana Bucket Brigade is my #1 organization that I really reach out to because they're always willing to connect you with various people. If you're thinking about people from, Cancer Alley, St. James Parish area, there's a lot going on in that area. Rise St. James is a growing grassroots organization there. And so I reach out to these different organizations that are working collaboratively and collectively with other grassroots organizations, and they will introduce you to those people who are members of those organizations. So the more voices, the better. And I always tell my coworkers, my other reporters in the newsroom about this, don't just focus on that one person that the LA Times interviewed. Find grassroots orgs where you can actually talk to people, various people.
Just to add to what they said, sometimes if there's a community that's sick of being interviewed, leave people alone. Sometimes you just have to respect that. But at the same time, there are a lot of communities that haven't gotten noticed that also might be down the road and have similar concerns or problems. And also like if you're reporting on a community that you're not part of and don't have a historic connection to, there are people whose job it is to do cultural competency reads. So, you know, in a perfect world, my favorite situation would be I get to spend a bunch of time getting to know people, building trust, finding out what they, you know, if I imagine them as my readers, not just my sources. What do they want to read about? And then I write the story, and then I fact check with them. Did I get what you were saying right? Did I kind of what you were talking about at the grocery store? But and I work with a cultural competency reader and make sure that that I'm doing it right. You don't always have time or the luxury of that kind to be able to do that kind of work. But you know, there is a point at which you say, I respect your right to be left alone. But then another thing that I just recently saw, I don't know if folks here read Scalawag, the magazine, but they recently did a piece where the writer was a white woman and she was reporting on an older black couple that had moved to start their own farm in Mississippi. And she ended up co-writing the story with the wife. It was a straight couple with the wife and the couple, and gave that source a byline. And then they worked collaboratively to write the story. They literally sat down and wrote it together. And I think that's a really interesting model. I would love to see that in other places, in other outlets as well.
Thank you all so much, both for being here and for the storytelling work that you do, especially your emphasis on finding those people whose stories aren't always told. I really appreciate that theme coming through the conversation. My name is Ian Hitchcock. I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student here. And as someone who has worked in the nonprofit space as, you know, a climate communicator, one of the things I always struggled with was how to talk about and communicate about climate in ways that weren't either overwhelming or despairing, right? How to make climate communications empowering without kind of sugarcoating the direness of the situation that we're in. So I guess I'm just curious for y'all in the work that you do, doing this day in and day out, like how do you think about kind of finding the balance between, you know, increasingly dire IPCC reports getting ignored and trying not to leave your audience just curled up in a fetal position under their bed?
Well, I think communications might be slightly different, but I would love to hear what you folks say about this. I don't necessarily think it's a journalist's job to worry about, like I think our first job is to tell the truth and get information out. It's not necessarily our job to regulate how people respond to that. And I think it's really easy to slide into advocacy, a little too far into advocacy if you do worry about that. But also as somebody, I have a MFA in creative writing, and as somebody who's like really thought a lot about narrative, to me it might not be finding the silver lining in the issue, it might be finding that really interesting character that, you know, if you tell a story well, it can be depressing as hell and people will stay with you and read it, you know, or it can be worrying or concerning. But if there's interesting voices, interesting scene, a nice narrative arc, even in an explainer that's like 600 words, you can get some of that scene in there. You can get some of that voice and tone and you know, people's personalities in there. People will stay with you for the story.
I write a lot about climate science, and I covered all 3 IPCC reports in the last, since 2021, right? And the way we told the story is one through really engaging visualizations and graphics where people can actually interact with it. And going back to what Maya said and what I said earlier is just putting that human face again to that story can be really impactful and can really make a change. And I would actually go out of my way to like talk to scientists and authors who can break down the science for me. Like, I don't care if I sound stupid on the phone while I'm interviewing them, even though I know what they're talking about. I'll be like, hey, so like, can you tell me what the key takeaways are, as if I'm like a 5th grader or something. Or like, you know, if I would ask them if they have an analogy or metaphor for something like so scientifically complicated that I need to explain to readers about. So those are some things that I would ask the scientists. And for IPCC, like the 3rd installment of IPCC, which is for folks, it's the Intergovernmental Panel of climate change under the UN. They release reports, these really state of the science report about climate change and where we're at in terms of warming every 6 to 7 years. And so they just released their latest installment the last year or so. And it's not gonna come out until like 6 years from now. But basically the third one is about solutions, right? And so the first one was science heavy. The second one was how we're running out of ways to adapt, very doom and gloomy. And then the third one is a lot of solutions. And so for the solutions part, I remember bringing in a story about going back to the Pacific Islands again, but a solution from the Pacific Islands where they use like coconut oil to power like and not, like actual oil and gas, like not relying on oil and gas, but being innovative in terms of using their own, like what the land has to offer in terms of like coconut oil and other things to power their own canoes and like boats and stuff to get around the island. And so stories like that was really impactful because they did mention indigenous solutions for the first time. And so so just talking to scientists that can really communicate well and just, having them really break it down for us in a very digestible way.
So just being cognizant of how much time we have, I see we have two more questions. Why don't we try to ask them one after the other, and then if we can try to combine the answers. I apologize if they're not similar questions, but I believe our workshop person is in the waiting room, so I want to make sure that we allot enough time for you guys to actually do the workshop. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm Laura Streitfeld. I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student here at Duke, and I want to thank you all for the way that you've talked about bringing these important stories to light and stories that might be invisible to the reader otherwise, or to viewers. I'm curious, in the era that we're living in where there's a lot of skepticism, where there's a lot of special interests driving stories, I'm wondering how you handle environmental stories like the Cancer Alley stories you're talking about, where the impacts may be invisible and also may not be able to be proven to be causal. So how much does that factor into how you tell a story, or how you try to bring relevance to the reader for something that you might not have as much evidence of as something where you can have a causal relationship, or a factor that's more visible like a storm?
Sorry to kind of hop on the tail end of that. I'm Zoe. I'm a freshman undergraduate, actually, and I'm from New Orleans, so a lot of the things that you talked about are very close to home to me. So in that vein, I'm kind of interested in how you all approach like grappling with the tension between like emotion and personal passion and the objectivity that we've talked about, and how you kind of like see that influence in your work.
The first environmental justice story I told was about Cancer Alley, and I was down there to do a story for Family Circle about one woman who kind of like stood up against something that was happening in her area. And while I was talking to her, she said, "Oh, you ought to hear what's going on over in Convent. And those women over there standing up to that." And when she said that, I was like, "What'd you say? What?" And it had gotten no national attention at that time, but it was this great David and Goliath story. And they were called pejoratively, them 7 Catholic women who down there creating all these problems for this big plan. But just going over there, listening to their story, it was so compelling. There were things that kind of couldn't be proven, but just made sense. And so I think if you connect the dots for people and really back that up, that's good enough. Not good enough, but I'm saying it generates interest and people can see the unfairness of it. So when the tobacco companies were saying, "Oh, we don't know enough," that is the biggest excuse. We don't know enough to regulate tobacco. We don't know enough that this is what's causing the cancer. We don't know, I just think that like we aren't scientists, but we need to lay out the clearest common sense case that we can make, and that kind of drives more research and more attention, and it forces those companies to answer more questions. And so the more they talk, the more trouble they're getting, because I will tell you this, they're all lying.
all of them. And they will lie to your face and tell you something isn't happening, and you can be looking at it and see it is happening. So just start off with the presumption that they're going to lie to you and just keep digging. But that's how
I will say CNN has a legal team that goes through all our stories, and so I go through another extra link to fact check my stories and make sure they're backed by data in terms of whether the EPA says this X census tract in Cancer Alley has this much cancer percentage, and so I will cite that, and there is data out there, and that's also why I file FOIA requests and reach out to. I hate doing this, but I have to, even though I just have to, even though it's already out there that Exxon knew that climate change was gonna, was a thing when they started emitting carbon emissions. But I have to reach out to Exxon and get their comment or side of things. And it gets very heated sometimes in our exchanges, but you have to do that. And I don't think a lot of people realize the work that a lot of us put into telling these stories. Maya and I were just talking about our friend Yvette, who's this amazing investigative reporter, and she was trying to prove the connection between lead and health impacts on people in California. And so, God bless Yvette, but she went through neighborhoods and actually tested soil herself. Got it funded, and she just went out and tested soil by herself in each neighborhood and found lead, and she's working on this big lead series right now. And so that's just one of the examples that we go through in terms of finding data and trying to prove stories that people tell us. Sharon Levine that I talked to from St. James Parish in Cancer Alley, she told me that she found aluminum in her blood, and she attributes that to the petrochemical facilities that are built around her. And so I talked to a doctor about it and to prove her point. And so getting those sources in addition to these personal stories. And I would just want to touch on the second question real quick before I hand it over to Maya, is that it's hard to detach that emotional connection from objectivity, because you're mostly out there with community members and actually shadowing them and living through what they're going through. You're breathing the same air as them. You're seeing how close they are from these plumes that are coming out of the refineries. And it's really heartbreaking when you're there. And so it's really hard to set aside that emotion. And all you have to do is really back it up with all the science and the data that's out there, and interview the right experts, interview the right people, so that what the advocates, what these activists are claiming, and the residents that are impacted are validated. And from my experience, they mostly are. So yeah, bottom line is it's hard.
To get to the second question first, I remember one of the first stories I worked on that was related to environmental policy, and talking to my editor and saying basically that I was worried because I was very emotionally invested in the topic and the outcome, and I was like, well, what do you do? And she said, just let the facts speak for themselves. So that's the point at which you really focus on explaining how X connects to Y connects to Z, or what the outcomes of this policy would be, and really be extra careful about just letting the facts speak for themselves. And part of that is, if I'm trying to get kind of both sides, this concerned citizen group said this, and then I turn to this other source to respond. I will often say in my stories, did not return requests for comment or refuse to comment. I will call people out if they will not, because then your readers can't say, well, you only talk to this one side. Yeah. And then in terms of something that I think we're sort of talking around is the concept of slow violence, and even just reading the preface of the book Slow Violence is super helpful. But I think there are times when it's okay to kind of confirm to your reader, it can be hard to be really interested in something that takes 25 years or a generation to develop when you could be reading about a hurricane. But that's part of the problem, and just sort of think through that with your reader, and I think that can be effective.
Wrap up with just one thing and say, I think we've kind of gotten into this like mindset where a journalist has to pretend there's no objective truth. Well, he said this and he said this, and so we just like, well, you never know. Well, you do know. If he said it's not raining and she said it's raining, your job isn't to say it, said it. Your job is to open the freaking window, look outside, see if it's raining, and tell the people what's happening. There are some things that are knowable. And we don't have to shy away from that for fear of being called, oh, well, there it is, left-leaning journalist. No, I'm this truth-leaning journalist. And I'm not, and I just think we have to be ready and prepared. And it is our job to say, to tell the facts. So thank you.
Sorry for that. That was an excellent point to end on. I was going to say the journalist's job is to speak truth to power. It's not to put climate deniers and climate activists on the same level, right? I think that's an excellent point. And I just want to really emphasize how much we appreciate all of your perspectives, your insights into advocacy journalism, solutions journalism, freelance journalism, institutional journalism, all the pieces, right? You guys hit every possible avenue as a journalist. So I really want to show gratitude, especially Rachel, you flying all the way down from New York, joining us today. So amazing.